the largest snake ever discovered was almost lost to history. Not because its bones were destroyed, but because fossils collected in the Cerrejón coal mines during the early 2000s were first catalogued alongside crocodilian remains. Only later did scientists realize these belonged to Titanoboa, a serpent that stretched nearly 42 feet and weighed more than a ton, 2,000 pounds. It lived in a climate hotter and more consistently humid than most modern tropical forest conditions that allowed reptiles to reach sizes unseen today, as Titanoboa's bulk itself revealed. This story begins with that first mistake bones mistaken for something far more ordinary. At first, the mystery animal from the Cerrejón coal mines bore the wrong identity. When miners and researchers uncovered thick, curved bones in the early 2000s, the logical conclusion was that they came from crocodile relatives. Fossil beds there already contained many dinosaurs, ancient river-dwelling crocodilians, so new pieces that looked similarly heavy and arched were grouped with the rest. In a site dominated by croc remains, the assumption seemed secure, and the supposed crocodile bones were filed away. This is a problem. Scientists face often vertebrae are notoriously hard to identify in isolation because many reptiles share broad backbone features. If only a fragment is available, assigning it to the most common local animal is a natural step, not a careless mistake. That reality shaped the early stage of Titanoboa's story, delaying recognition of something extraordinary. What changed the picture was a closer anatomical inspection. The vertebrae did not quite match crocodile proportions. Crocodilian backbones are narrower and more rounded, but these fossils were unusually wide and thick. In anterior view, the centra formed striking pentagonal outlines, a shape typical in boyd snakes rather than crocs. Even more telling, the neural spines that rose from the top of each vertebra were not simple ridges, but expanded into flattened, T-shaped structures, muscle attachment surfaces known from snakes. Those clues forced paleontologists to reconsider their first identification. That reconsideration immediately raised a scale problem. If these bones were snake vertebrae, they were vastly larger than any modern boa or anaconda could produce. Instead of hand-sized hints, researchers found vertebrae far larger than those of any living species, pointing to an animal on an entirely different scale. For a time, even with the T-shaped spines in hand, investigators hesitated. Declaring the existence of a giant snake risked sounding less like science and more like a campfire exaggeration. But the key evidence kept accumulating. Excavations continued, and teams eventually recovered vertebrae from dozens of individuals across the Cerrejón Formation. This detail proved critical. The enormous size was not a fluke of one outsized animal. Again and again, the same robust pentagonal vertebrae appeared, confirming that this was a consistent species trait. The so-called crocodile bones were in fact the backbone of an entire population of gargantuan snakes. Even with hundreds of vertebrae catalogued, there were still uncertainties. Scientists could work out rough length estimates, but with no head bones available, the complete image of the animal was blurry. How powerful was its bite, and how big was its skull compared to its body? The fossils had revealed a snake of tremendous size, but proof of its full scale still rested on a missing piece. That gap in the puzzle set the stage for one of the rarest fossil finds in snake paleontology, the day that a fragment of skull finally emerged. That breakthrough finally came in 2011 when expeditions to the Cerrejón site turned up something almost never seen in the snake fossil record: skull elements. Snakes rarely preserve their heads, since the skull is built from many fragile pieces that tend to disarticulate and vanish before fossilization. Yet in the coal beds of Colombia, paleontologists recovered fragments from 3 disarticulated skulls. For the first time, Titanoboa could be measured not only from its vertebrae, but from its head, providing a much sharper picture of its proportions. Before those discoveries, size reconstructions had to rely entirely on vertebrae. That method suggested an average length of about 42 feet, based on ratios taken from boas and anacondas today. But vertebrae vary depending on where in the spine they come from, and small errors compound quickly at such large scales. For years, there was disagreement: was Titanoboa a true giant among snakes, or simply at the extreme end of normal Boyd variation? The 16-inch skull provided a decisive reference point. Substantially larger than skulls of living anacondas, it confirmed that this snake's head alone rivaled the body length of smaller reptiles. Applying modern anaconda proportions to that measurement yielded new estimates. Instead of 42 feet, Titanoboa's upper size stretched closer to 47 feet, with a margin of error just above 3 feet. This didn't make the earlier vertebra-based numbers wrong. It simply narrowed the range and showed that the animal likely reached the upper end of those predictions. Mass estimates, however, proved far trickier. Early averages placed Titanoboa at well over a ton, 2,000 pounds in weight, but later biomechanical scaling equations suggested lower maxima. In other words, we can be certain Titanoboa was enormously heavy for any snake, though the exact figure remains debated. Beyond size, the skull offered anatomical insights that vertebrae could never reveal. Titanoboa had a greater number of tooth positions along the jaws and palate than any of its close relatives, forming a broad bite surface. Its quadrate bone angled low, extending the lower jaw well behind the skull and enlarging its gape. The teeth themselves were weakly fused to the jaws, an arrangement common in snakes designed to grip and swallow struggling prey whole. Taken together, the skull elements painted a portrait of a specialized constrictor unique within the Boyd family. This evidence also cut through the more sensational claims. The skull anatomy shows no sign of venom delivery. The animal was a constrictor. And certain palate details hint that Titanoboa was well adapted for taking fish, not for hunting mammals on land. That shifted the image away from monster stories toward an animal exquisitely suited to its swamp environment. With the skull evidence secured, Titanoboa finally emerged as a consistent, repeatable giant rather than an exaggeration. But the question that followed was just as important as its size. In what kind of ecosystem could a snake of this scale survive? In the ancient wetlands of Serrejon, Titanoboa reigned as the dominant force. 60 million years ago, this part of Colombia was not the open coal beds you see today, but a vast coastal plain of tropical forest and swamp. Heavy rainfall kept the system waterlogged year-round, with precipitation estimates even higher than those of the modern Amazon. Rivers flowed in slow meanders through palm thickets, creating stagnant backwaters crowded with life. Fossils from these deposits reveal oversized freshwater turtles, multiple genera of dinosaurs, long snouted crocodile relatives, and schools of large bony fish. Within that setting, Titanoboa was the top predator, perfectly suited to a landscape of warmth and water. Early speculation imagined this giant snake terrorizing land mammals. But the evidence from its skull revisions points another way. Its tooth count, jaw expansion, and loose dental attachment all resemble modern snakes that specialize in fish. Combined with the abundance of lungfish and osteoglossomorph fossils in Serrejon, the pattern favors a semi-aquatic fish-eating lifestyle similar to living anacondas. That does not exclude variety. Large constrictors can and do take sizable reptiles when the chance arises, so young turtles or crocodilian species were probably not safe. Still, fish were the reliable core of its diet. The water itself gave Titanoboa critical advantages. On land, a snake of 1 ton, 2,000 pound mass would have faced serious mobility challenges, but immersed in rivers, buoyancy supported its great weight. This allowed the animal to lie nearly motionless below the surface, obscured from view, until a surge of muscle carried its jaws onto passing prey. Its cranial design allowed for enormous gape expansion, enough to swallow bodies as bulky as its own diameter. Concealed beneath murky surfaces, Titanoboa turned those wetlands into an arena of ambush. Heat shaped its possibilities. Plant fossils from Ceredigion show chemical signatures that, compared with Titanoboa's size, imply mean annual temperatures of 86 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmth on that scale supports rapid metabolism for reptiles, making larger ectotherms viable. But the temperature as thermometer method sparked a debate. Some scientists argued it inflated Paleocene climate estimates, while the research team defended the idea of hotter, more consistent tropical conditions than today's rainforests. Scientists also debated whether an ectotherm of such size might risk overheating, which is why behavior and reliance on water almost certainly played a role in keeping its body regulated. These uncertainties underline that Titanoboa is not merely a giant snake, it is a critical marker in the long conversation about climate. The ecosystem itself was a roster of giants. Dinosaurs, such as Acherontosuchus, Anthracosuchus, and Ceredigionisuchus, occupied separate niches, some long-snouted for fish, others broad-headed for larger prey. Turtles like Carbonemes reached car-sized dimensions, dominating the shallows. Titanoboa stood above them, all tying the system together as apex constrictor of the swamps. Later, a life-sized reconstruction displayed in museums made its proportions tangible, ensuring the public could see what an apex reptile from the Paleocene really looked like. In the end, Titanoboa's role as ruler of this swampy rainforest highlights just how much one discovery can reshape our picture of Earth's past. And it reminds us that misidentified fossils can conceal truths far more significant than their labels suggest. Titanoboa's discovery shows how one mislabeled bone can conceal a world-changing find, one that points toward a much warmer, swamp-dominated Paleocene tropics, and reminds us that science refines its claims step by step. From those first vertebrae mistaken for crocodile remains to the later recovery of skulls, the evidence built a case for a snake widely regarded as the largest in the fossil record by length and mass estimates derived from multiple individuals. Exhibits at the Smithsonian and a documentary series have since carried this story to a global audience. If that surprises you, leave a comment about the single discovery that most changed how you see the past. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into scientific detective work, hit subscribe to see more.